Welcome back. So today we want to continue our discussion of responsive web design. We've started talking about this in a few different areas already, even beginning back in chapter 1. And we've talked a little bit about it in sort of a lab setting outside of lectures. But we want to dive into a few different topics and a few different tools that you can use to build websites that are responsive. A big thing that we're going to introduce in Chapter 8 is something called media queries, which is a really, really critical piece in building truly responsive web applications. So let's get going. Our objectives today, as far as applied objectives, we want you to be able to take a fixed layout and convert it to fluid take a layout that's built with fixed widths and convert it to use fluid widths, use images that scale dynamically in terms of their size based on the size of the viewport. And we'll also look a little bit at inherited fonts or inherited font sizes more specifically. We want to also, through this, you should be able to take a page that's already in a fluid layout and add media queries that change its appearance based on the size of the screen that it's shown on. So it may have one layout on desktop and another layout on mobile. We'll cover briefly the SlickNav plugin, which you can use to build a mobile dynamic, have it automatically build a mobile navigation menu for you. That's good for smaller screens. We'll look at a little bit about using some of the browser developer tools to test your responsive designs. Some of this we've already talked about, but we'll go over it again. We'll talk about, we want you to be able to, we'll talk about some of the components, some of the common components that go into responsive web design. We'll want you to be able to describe some of the ways that you can test it. We'll talk about what some of the differences are between fluid layouts and fixed layouts. Again, we've covered a little bit of that already, so just a refresher. We'll talk about why you might want to use relative font sizes in your responsive design, specifically rather than say fixed font sizes or absolute font sizes. We'll talk about briefly the meta element, the meta viewport element that you need to add to support mobile devices and how that works. We'll talk, and then finally we'll conclude by talking about media queries and how we can use that to change the CSS that's applied to our pages and the layout that we see based on the size of the screen. And we'll also talk about two different ways to approach that problem. Okay, so first of all, what is responsive web design? What are some of the components of that? What does that look like? So here we've got a website that's built for desktop, okay? And we want to see, well, what can we do to make this work on mobile? Well, first we might have to go and look and see what are some of the problems. What are some of the problems with this website as it stands for moving it to mobile? Well, the first thing I notice is the header and the nav bar sections are just way too wide, right? They take up way too much space. They may look fine on a desktop, on a laptop, but they are just taking up too much screen real estate for a mobile device, okay? So we're gonna have to figure out a way to eliminate some of these things that are up in the top of the screen, okay? Well, so what are some things that we could do? Well, first of all, the checkout button, well, maybe I don't need that word checkout. Maybe that can be just an icon. Maybe I can do that, okay? So let's get rid of that. Maybe FAQ, contact us, adoptions, apparel, gifts, maybe those links don't need to be there all the time. So I could put those links off into a collapsible menu. What about the text that's here? Well, maybe this and free shipping, maybe those two labels aren't all that valuable. they're occupying some space. Maybe I could put them somewhere else, or maybe I can just eliminate them entirely on mobile. So I might take that. We also can look over here. Well, we've got the logo. We've actually kind of got it twice. We've got WWF as the logo here, and we've got WWF gifts. Well, maybe we only need one of those logos. So that's another thing that we can do. So that's looking at the top of the page, and that's where a lot of your first issues that you have to address oftentimes when you're moving a website that's designed for desktop to mobile is how to fix the nav bar and the header. You generally have to fix those problems first. The next thing we can see is going down. Well, okay, so we've got this section and that, and this image that's over on the right. Well, if we just make the screen smaller, we're going to find out that that image reduces really the space of readable text that I have. So two options I can do with that image. One is I could eliminate it entirely because it's more decorative than anything else. Or I could move it above or below this header. Maybe I move it below the gift adoption cards header, but between the text. Or I could move it above that text. Either way, that would result in a website that's much more mobile friendly. Okay, so here's there's more than one way to attack this. Here's the approach that they have taken, right? So the approach that they have taken is on the nav bar side. Here's what it looks like in portrait. Here's what it looks like in landscape. Well, they've decided to keep both of those logos. If it were me, I would eliminate this WWF gifts if it were me, and just keep the other one. But they've kept both. Here we can see that there's the shopping cart icon, and it's just a single icon. There's no big red button with the text. It's just an icon, and that's okay. Most people understand what a shopping cart icon means. And then you'll see that there's this triple bar or hamburger icon, which is the menu. You expand that, it would expand and show you those options that were normally automatically visible. You can also see the text here, this blurb as well as free shipping, that those have been moved down, right? So those have been moved down to be part of the page and not really the header anymore. You can also see it looks like that image has been eliminated entirely. So they've done all of those things to try and make it more mobile friendly. You'll also notice that the search bar, they've moved it down to give it more space. So whereas it was here just occupying only a small amount of space up in the top part of the nav bar, they've moved it down a step, and now it occupies the full width of the screen, which is great. Means user can find it more easily, but it also allows more space for that search bar, which is really good for mobile, because that's a commonly used feature on mobile. All right. So a few common components that make up a good responsive web design are fluid layouts. If we're using a fixed layout, it's generally not going to work so well across different screen sizes. So moving to something that's more fluid, namely using percentages for our widths and heights, is going to be a lot better, and it's going to scale a lot better. So that's one component. We're also going to use media queries, which we'll talk about towards the end of this, which is a way to say, I want to have this CSS at this screen size and this other screen CSS at another screen size. You also want your images to generally be scalable. Now, there's a lot more to making images scalable than what's covered here. One big tool to making images scalable is using something called an SVG. SVGs are a lot more scalable. They're what we call vector images as opposed to raster images. So SVG images scale really smoothly between your 4K monitors and your small resolution smartphones. So those are really helpful. But they're going to talk. But the one thing we'll mention here is just how to adjust the width a little bit dynamically, but there's definitely some limits to what we're going to talk about here in terms of actually scaling images. But that is one part of it, oftentimes. So now that we've kind of talked about what responsive design, web design looks like, what tools can we use to test it? How are we going to test our responsive web design to see if it actually works, and what is it going to look like on different sizes of screens? The easiest approach maybe is to take your browser and resize the window, right? That's the simplest and the easiest approach. That's the place you can start. But oftentimes that's not enough, okay? So other approaches that we can take, we could potentially deploy our website to a server, put it out there actually on the internet, and then load it up on each of the devices we want to test it with. Load it up on a laptop that's got a 4K screen, load it up on a laptop that's got a 1080p screen, load it up on a smaller laptop, load it up on a Chromebook, load it up on a MacBook and a Windows XP machine, and yada 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 yada, or Android devices of all different sizes, from some smartphones and tablets, and try it on all of those actual physical hardware. We can do that, but that is extremely costly. It takes the most work. So if we are going to do that, we typically only do that infrequently. So that may be something that we only do a test every 6 months to a year on all of those devices, just because it takes that long to do all that testing. So those are going to be tools that we only use when we're basically finished with the project and we're ready to get it into our users' hands, or if we find out from users that they're having problems. So we can do that, but it's really late in the process, and it takes a lot of time to do that kind of testing. So other tools that we can use, we can also maybe try it on emulators, simulators for different browsers, even booting up virtual machines to try and see what it would look like on those devices. That usually gives us at least some insights, some better insights. That's easier to set up and run. Some earlier insights, that's easier to set up and run than actually using physical hardware. Rather than using actual devices, using virtual machines and such, and emulators does take a lot less work to set up and to test. However, it's still a decent amount of work, and it's still something that maybe you get it up and running. Practically, you can only do that testing maybe once a month to hit all of those kind of things. Once every 1 to 3 months, because it still takes a good amount of time to do all that testing that way. So it's things we can do, but it still takes a lot of time. Other tools, a third option of how to do this testing is there's actually developer tools built into all of the modern browsers. And those are really easy to use and really quick. So those are the developer tools that are built in, are things that we can use constantly as we're building the website. And while they're not perfect, they won't necessarily tell us all of the things that we might see on an actual mobile device. Like they're not necessarily great for telling us, is the text too small or is the text too big? They're not good for that because you're seeing it at a different scale than what it would actually be physically. So things like that, where you really care about how big is this going to be in a physical dimension, how many inches is this going to be on the screen? Those are still things that it's best to test on a physical device. But besides that, we can test most things through the developer tools. So specifically what we'll do is, Chrome's our target browser at the moment primarily, so we'll be using I'll go through how to use the developer tools in Chrome. But Firefox, I believe Brave, and Internet Explorer all have very similar tools to this that we can use to test our websites. So let me pop over to my other screen. All right, so I have one in the examples here. There's a few different ways to get into this developer tool, into these developer tools in Chrome. The way I usually get there is I just push the F12 key. The F12 key will bring me into that mode. F12 will bring me out. The other way that you can get there, if you go into the triple dot here, go to More Tools, and you go to Developer Tools, that will also get in here. The other way you can go into here, which I see most people using, you right click anywhere in the page, go inspect, now you're in there. You're looking at that element. So again, usually the way I get in there is just by pressing the F12 key. Now, once we're in the developer tools mode, you'll probably see a view like this. It does change a little bit based on how big you make this. You can also dock it to different sides. So for instance here, I've docked it to the right hand side. If you want to dock it to the bottom like you see in the slides, you can click the triple dot here, more options, and go down here and dock to bottom. Right, so now we'll be on the bottom if that helps you for whatever you're doing. Okay, I'm going to go back to docking on the right because that's what works best for me. Now, once I'm in this view, you'll notice I can kind of resize the width. And that will give me some control, roughly the same amount of control as resizing the window. But I can also click the button up here to toggle the device toolbar. Well, that will put me into a completely different view here to look at the page. And you'll notice that there's a toolbar that shows up here, right, which will give us some options to change what the device is. So for instance here I've got the iPhone 5 selected because that's usually what I test against. But I can also select some of those other devices and see what it would look potentially like on those devices. If you pick responsive up here, that allows you to freely resize the width and height of the device. You also have the option in here to change the zoom factor. So specifically, if you are thinking on, the way this works on hardware, if you're using a mobile device, you can pinch to zoom in and zoom out using 2 fingers. Well, that adjusts the zoom. So if I want to see what it would be if I zoomed in with the pinch, I can see 150%, 50%. So I can also kind of test what it would happen as I zoom in and zoom out on a mobile device. But typically you want to leave this at 100% so you can kind of get a good view of what it would actually look like. So we can resize that as we need to. Going back to the iPhone 5, there's another option here which allows me to rotate the device so I can rotate between a landscape orientation and a portrait orientation. So that's super helpful. Now, another thing you may notice as I'm moving my cursor around here, you'll notice that it has changed to kind of a circle instead of my usual pointer. And part of that is to kind of emulate or remind you that, hey, this is a touchscreen. So it does actually emulate, when you're in this mode, it does actually emulate some of those sort of touchscreen features. Which is good because you can also do things like swiping up or swiping down as you're working through this, and you can see what would happen as you're tapping through. So those things are all very helpful. That it tries to emulate a touchscreen, not just having you resizing the window or changing it to a mobile screen. That ability to test touch interactions is really, really helpful. All right, so that's how you get to that. Those are the tools that are available when you're trying to test your responsive designs. So I'd strongly advise you to kind of play around with that and see how that works. I'm going to get back to my slides. So let's talk about fluid layouts. Again, we covered this in a previous chapter, but we want to go into it in maybe a little bit more depth. So specifically, when we're talking about fluid layouts, we're typically talking about the width and the heights and specifying the widths in terms of either percentages or viewport units. Okay. So if you're working with a website that is already out there, that already has a fixed layout, you may need to go through and convert it to a relative layout. Okay. So this is how we would do that. We would start by looking at the original layout. Okay, so we see the original layout here in this case has a fixed width of 960. Right, it's fixed. The actual body is fixed to 960 pixels wide. Okay, well, I want to change that to a percentage. So in this case, I'm going to say that 960, we're going to make it 90%. So 90% of whatever the current screen width is. And that 90% number is basically arbitrary. It could be 80%, it could be 70%, it could be 90%. Higher is generally better, but that's a number that you basically just pick. The rest of the calculations don't really necessarily rely on that. Okay, so now going down to the header. So the header in this fixed width was defined to be originally 960 pixels. Well, if you remember right, the body was also 960 pixels. So really the goal of that 960 pixels was to make the header always match up with the width of the page, make it the full width of the page. Okay, well, so then I would want that to be 100%. Okay, so I'm going to take that from being 960 pixels to 100% because I want to occupy whatever that is. Now, note that when I'm specifying 100% here, that's not 100% of the viewport. It's 100% of the container that it's in. So we've already defined the body as being 90% of the width of the viewport. So effectively, by setting this to 100%, we're kind of multiplying those two things together. So with this thing being 100% and that being 90%, this will actually be 90% of the viewport. Okay, even though we've set it to 100%. That 100% is 100% of its container. Same thing with the footer. The footer we want to occupy the full width, so we're going to set it to 100%. Okay. Next, looking at the main area and the sidebar. Well, the main area originally was defined to be 600 pixels, and the sidebar was defined to be 360 pixels. And both of those were relative to the page. The target, what we're basing that on was a page that's 960 pixels wide. So if I do a little math, I say, well, what's 600 pixels divided by 960 pixels? That will give me a percentage to say, okay, well, 600 is 62.5% of 960. Similarly, 360 is 37.5% of 960. So if we look at that, it's roughly 2/3 of the screen width is going to go to roughly 2/3 of this width is going to go to our main area, and 1/3 of that width is going to go to the aside. Is how that kind of falls out. Okay. So what are some of the benefits of using a fluid layout over using a fixed layout? Okay. So one of the upsides of using a fluid layout is that it then becomes proportional to the size of the screen. So as your screen gets larger or bigger, those things change. You know, the width of that will change to occupy more or less space. So in terms of what that means, you can think physically or where that is, it's still roughly the same percentage. In theory, at least, and this has been kind of the old thinking on fluid layouts. there's a little bit more to it now. But the theory was that, well, if we build something as a fluid layout, it's going to be scalable so that if there's another screen size that comes out in the future, it'll just automatically adapt to that new screen size. And that's what we had thought in the 90s, the early 2000s, that, well, if we make our layouts scalable, they'll adapt to any screen size that comes out there. Well, then we got smartphones, and we also later on got 4K screens. And our fluid layouts were simply not enough to adapt to either smartphones, or they don't even work well on 4K screens, just because the changes in screen size are so drastic. You're talking from going from a desktop screen down to a smartphone, and not only are you changing from a portrait orientation to a landscape orientation, you're also going down a fourth of the screen real estate. That's pretty drastic. Possibly even more than a fourth. Versus, on the other hand, if you think about, well, this website here, these examples in the book, they were based on seeing the websites are primarily on targeted for screens that are roughly 1,000 pixels wide. Well, on a 4K screen is about 4,000 pixels wide. So you got 4 times the width, and height's also going up. So when you're looking at a 4K screen, you have 4 times the width, or roughly 16 times the screen real estate. Even a fluid layout doesn't scale well in terms of increasing your screen real estate by 4 times or 16 times. That just doesn't work, right? So it might seem okay to just, fluid layouts will be enough in this narrow range, but it really isn't enough. When we go and we change the size of the screens as much as they've changed, both going down to smaller screens as well as going up to larger screens. So it's a good start, but fluid layouts only work in kind of a narrow band of resolutions. It's a wider band than a fixed layout, but it's still a narrow band of where they're really usable. So do keep that in mind. Fluid layouts will not solve all your problems, although that they are a great tool along the way. Okay. So it used to be that we, with the thought of most screens are roughly the same size. Well, we could add media. We could usually just say, okay, this will work just fine. I don't need to add media queries on top of that. But nowadays, any website that you build really is going to need media queries to do more than what the fluid layouts can do by themselves. You're going to need media queries to handle mobile devices, and you're going to need media queries to handle even the larger screens, because there's so much difference in both directions. So if we're starting with going back to kind of where we're at here, we're starting with a fixed layout, and we want to convert it to fluid. We can use this formula to do that conversion, to get roughly the same behavior as we had before. So if I say the target is the screen size that the original design was targeting, right? So if the original design was targeting a screen that was 1280 pixels wide, that would be my target. Okay. Next, I'm dividing by context. Context would be, context is more that where I put that 1280. Sorry. So target is how many pixels do I want it to be wide, and then context is based on kind of what was that originally. What width was that originally. Okay. So I multiply that by 100. That gives me my resulting percentage. So if we start with this page, we've got some basic HTML. This is based on that previous diagram that we had where we have a header, a main, an aside, and a footer. Let's say I take those fixed widths that I had previously, and here's how some of those calculations fall out. So here I might say, okay, well, let's set the body. Well, this is how we're going to change the CSS. We're going to change the CSS from setting the body to 960, set it to 90%. For both the header and the footer, you see we're going to change that to 100%. So our target, again, that was originally 960, so that's our target. And then the context, you think the container that it was in was 960. So 960 divided by 960 is 1. Multiply that by 100, we get 100. Similarly with the main and the aside, we say 600 divided by 960, 360 divided by 960. Okay, there's our percentages. Also in here, you'll note that they've set a maxed width on the actual body. So they've set a max width of 1024. Well, what that really means is that it can't get bigger than 1024, which means that you're kind of bounding the screen sizes that this works on. So any screen that's bigger than 1024, all that extra space will end up getting used as margin, just white space. It will be effectively thrown away, which means that, say, on a 4K screen, if you're building it this way, the mask width of 1024, on a 4K screen, you're only using a fourth of the width. You're only using a fourth of the width of that screen. So that is pretty darn wasteful. It means that your website will look roughly the same way. It's more likely that your website will look roughly the same way on a 4K screen as it did on your 1280 screen, but it means that you're wasting so much of that screen real estate. It's not even funny. So that's one thing you can put on there if you're kind of trying to take an older website and upgrade it to be more responsive. That can be a tool in there to set the max width. But if you're really trying to get it into working well across all screen sizes, that may cause some additional problems at the larger end of your screen real estate. All right. Other units that you can use to size your layout for responsive purposes. You can use VH units, which again, 1 VH is 1% of the viewport height. You can use VW units, which are 1% of viewport width. Vmin is 1% of whichever is the smallest dimension. So in a portrait orientation, Vmin would be your width, and Vmax would be your height. In a landscape orientation, your Vmin would be your height, and your Vmax would be your width. So it helps you to maybe be more orientation agnostic, per se. I would say there is some usefulness occasionally to Vmin and Vmax, but they're definitely ones that we don't use very often because they tend to have some weird, unpredictable behavior where, okay, things all of a sudden get taller than maybe they should be. So the one we use the most, I would definitely say, would be the VW unit. VH obviously has its uses as well. For instance, for keeping footers at the bottom of your screen. But VW is definitely the most used one. So we can use those VH. We can use these viewport units in the same place where we would use the percentage units. The difference being the percentage units are based on context. They're based on what is the height or width of the container. These percentage units these viewport units are based on the size of the viewport, not on the size of the container. So that can be helpful for layout purposes sometimes. especially if I'm trying to put more than one thing horizontally next to each other. Maybe I want a 4-column layout. There is some benefit to using VW25 over using 25%, depending on how you're, because it's a little bit more agnostic of where the containers are potentially. So there's a little bit of give and take. Sometimes percentages are better, sometimes your viewport units are better, but we use them in the same kind of places where we want to have a fluid layout. Okay. Another component of building responsive designs oftentimes is to make the font sizes be relative. And the main reason why we want to do that is because the user has the option to increase or decrease the size of the font in their operating system, mainly for making text easier to read. So a lot of users that are maybe hard of seeing, have vision difficulties, they may need to increase the font size across the board. And the way that we do that in Windows, so let's take a look here. If I right click on the desktop, this is where you can test this. So display settings, in Windows, there. You'll note here I can change the size of text, right? I can change the size of things in my computer. So if I want to say, let's make everything just a little bit, just bigger, 150%. Well, now every app on my computer, the text size will now be 150% of what it normally was. And that can be helpful when you have either a high resolution monitor or you just have vision difficulties. So if we size our fonts in absolute units, say pixels specifically, if we size all our fonts in pixels, that setting doesn't really apply. Or that setting, there may be issues with that. So generally speaking, we need to set it to all of our font sizes, as many as we can. We're going to set those using relative units rather than fixed units, so that they can kind of scale both with their context as well as browser and operating system settings, which may affect the size of fonts. Android, by the way, also has a similar setting to that, where you can also increase font sizes to 150% across the board. Okay. So the first place to start, you can do this in the body, you can do this in the HTML. Generally, we do this in the HTML tag, even though the example here shows it as body. We'll want to change the font size. So most browsers, the normal font size, the base font size, most browsers start at roughly 16 pixels as the base font size. So you kind of use that as your baseline if you have to convert from absolute font sizes to relative ones. So here we're going to say, well, all right, the base is roughly 16, we'll say 100%. Okay, so we're going to say 100% is our base font size. And again, for most users, that will be roughly 16. If I had, say, my operating system font sizes is turned up to 150%, that would start me out at 24 instead of starting me at 16 pixels. So that kind of puts my baseline there rather than implicitly defining it. Now, one note here, you can set that in EM. The problem is that several older versions of IE, Internet Explorer, do not really handle that base font size as EM correctly. So to support older versions of IE, or all versions of IE, we want to set that as in percentage rather than setting that based on EMs. Everything else from here we'll set in REMs or EMs. So we're going to set that to 100%, and then from there, everything else, rather than setting it in pixels, I'll set it as EMs or REMs or percentages. So here we've got 28. Originally it was 28 pixels was defined here because it was a fixed sort of layout. I want to convert that to EM, so I'm going to say 28 divided by 16. Well, that gives me 1.75. So that 1.75 EM was equivalent to the 28, but now I can easily increase and decrease the size of of text across the entire website just by changing this one number, rather than having to fine-tune every single font size that I have. So I just change one number and everything goes up and down. Same thing here, 1.5, 1.125, 0.75. One thing that we'll run into, we're going to talk about media queries in a little bit. Doing this, moving to relative font sizes like this, actually makes it really easy for us to say, well, for mobile devices, I want the screen the fonts to be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, or for bigger screen size, I want the fonts to be bigger or smaller. So that's one of the big benefits of switching over to relative units from fixed units. Is that then we can just tweak one number, the font size of the body or the font size of the HTML, and then that increases and decreases the font size across the entire website. That doesn't happen if you're using pixels everywhere. Okay, so again, going through calculations, 24 divided by 16 gives us 1.5, etc., etc., etc. Now, I would generally recommend setting these font sizes in rem rather than EM, making them relative to the root, relative to the font size in the HTML, rather than EM, because EM is based on the size of your container. And that can lead to a few problems sometimes, simply because you may apply font size to a parent and then a child and things like that, and then those things kind of are inherited. Unfortunately, that way of inheriting font sizes, plenty of people still do it, but it tends to create a lot of debugging problems as your website gets bigger. So starting with rems as your way of specifying font sizes generally creates a website that's easier to debug because you're not relative to the current context. Again, there are some cases where you do want it to be relative to the context, so take that with a grain of salt. But most of the time, having it context sensitive with EM over rem is not usually a good thing. So I would recommend using rem for your font sizes, not EM. So there's the calculation. Let's say we want to convert an absolute, a fixed font size from pixels to EM. We're just going to divide by 16. If you want to convert it to percentage, you divide it by 16 and then multiply it by 100. So here I would say I want to represent this as percentage. That would mean the H1 is 175% instead of 1.75. Yeah. Okay. Now, scaling images. So specifically what we're going to talk about here is using the max width setting to control the size of an image. So here, let me pull this example up. We've got an image on the left-hand side, and we've got kind of it nested into a fluid layout. So this is 7 scale images, open with live server. So if I'm looking at this in the browser, as I make the window bigger, you can see that there's a little bit of change, but at this point there's a limit on how big they've imposed a limit on how big the body can get. So at this point the image is not changing because the container it's in is also not changing. Okay. Now if I go in and remove that, right, I remove that maximum. So let's say we remove the maximum width. I am on the wrong example. I want to look at 7 scale images. And that goes to main CSS. So its body, there we go. So it's maxed out at 960 pixels. So let's turn that off. So that will let it get bigger, right? So what you can see is as I'm changing the size of the layout, size of the viewport, that image is getting smaller and larger, okay? So there's a few keys to making that work. The first thing you want to do, in order for images to actually scale like this, you need to not set their width and height in HTML. Because if you set their width and height in HTML, that will always override your settings in CSS. Okay, you can kind of think about it as, you know, inline CSS almost. So, for instance, in here, let's play around with that and see what would happen if I just added a width and height to the HTML. So let's say width is 100. Height is 200. What we can see, that's the wrong image, because that's the Murach logo. I want to change the image here in the center. So, enter. So let's say the width here is 100. And the height is 200. All right, so we can see that the size of that has changed, but we can also see as I'm changing the size of the browser now, it doesn't change, okay? So again, if you're gonna make these sizes, the images scale fluidly, or scale with the size of the viewport, you cannot set the width and height in HTML. Okay, so these do have the benefit of potentially increasing, remember, the speed at which the page is rendered. Unfortunately, they also take away that ability to then size the image with CSS. So if we want to be able to size an image with CSS, we have to not set the width and height in the HTML. Okay. The next thing, so once we've removed the width and height there, if we haven't applied any CSS, that image will now be at the native resolution of the image. So for instance, if I pull this image up, we can see it's natively, it's a very large image, okay? And one thing to remember there is when the user's opening your website, they're always going to download that entire original image. So if we're looking at the context that we're using it in, it's probably honestly would be worth us going into an image editor and go ahead and scaling this down a bit, simply because we're probably never going to use it at the scale, the actual scale and size that it is originally. We're always going to use it at a smaller scale. So anyway, we've removed the width and height. We're going to go in the CSS. And the style that we've applied to this to make it scale is we've set the max width to 100%. So if I look for section image, which is here, what we've done is we set this max width to 100%, and that's what's allowing it, that's what's making it scale. If I didn't have this here, again, we can see it would always be the native size of the image. So it's going to be rather large, right? So regardless of what I change the viewport size, without that CSS, the size of the image doesn't change. But by setting the max width to 100%, what I've said is it can't get bigger than the size of its container. And what that means realistically is that it can freely scale down, but it will never scale the image up. By setting the max width, I've allowed it to scale the image down as needed, but I haven't allowed it to scale it up. So for instance, if I were maybe to give this column a little bit more space at some point, and maybe I can, yeah, let's zoom out. So at some point, here I'm zoomed out far enough, you can see that it stops scaling. So on a screen that's big enough or an image that's small enough, that will stop scaling once it gets to 100%, you know, of its normal size. Okay, so this approach of setting max width to 100% allows it to scale down, but not to scale up. If I want to do another way I can approach this is I can say, well, I want the maximum size of this image to be 400 pixels, and I'm going to set the width to 100%. What this will do is it'll say, well, I'd like it to be take up the full size of this space, full size of the container, but don't go over 400. You know, don't scale the image above 400. So you can see at this range, it doesn't scale it up, but as I go down smaller, now it'll start scaling it down. So both of these approaches result in the image being only scaled down, but never scaled up. And that's okay. That's a good thing. Because generally speaking, you can scale an image down without getting any sort of major artifacts. Your image will usually look good, continue to look good as you scale it down. However, when you scale an image up beyond its native resolution, you tend to end up with an image that is blurry. So both of those are approaches that you can take for scaling images down as need be. Let me undo these changes. Discard changes. Get back to where we were originally, and let me hop back over. Save. Let me hop back over to the slides. Okay. So here we've got another example. Well, let me just go back. Here we've got another example of what all these components that we've looked at so far might look like together if we combine them. So let's go to Book Apps, Chapter 8, Fluid, Town Hall. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the Samson page, Samson speaker page. All right, so here we've got a layout that, as you can see, is somewhat fluid. At the upper sides of things, you can see that there's a limit to how wide they're letting it be. So at this upper end, all we're doing is we're just adding more white space to the left and the right using auto margins once it gets up to the maximum width. And then as I scale it down, you can start seeing things starting to compress and the widths of the different components changing. Now you'll notice that there are maybe some artifacts here on the nav bar where as it falls down, as it gets smaller, these links go to 2 lines of text, and that's breaking. So that's one thing that you might want to fix to make this work a little bit better responsively. You'll also notice right now that we're not moving this nav bar. It's still occupying some space there. It is using a fluid layout again, so that you can see the size of both of these components is changing. What we haven't done is change the layout based on the screen size yet, okay, which is kind of the next thing we want to talk about. But you can see the fluid layouts, you can see the images scaling, you can see all those different parts that we've talked about so far. So the next thing we want to talk about is how do I actually go and change the website based on based on what size screen it is. Well, another tool there is one tool that we need to talk about before we get there. Okay, so let me open up the right example here. So File, Open Folder. I'm actually going to go back a chapter. Go back to Chapter 7, Town Hall. Pull this up. Let's look at Samson. Okay, so here, looking at this on a desktop, this kind of looks okay. Okay, now if I hit F12, let's go into the mobile view of this. You'll see what the website looks like. Okay, and namely, you'll see that it almost looks like it's scaled out. You know, almost as if the view is very scaled down. So if I were to take this page right now and pull this up onto either an Android phone or an iPhone, this is actually what it would look like, which is not terribly user-friendly, right? If I come to this, I immediately know, oh, this is a website that's designed for desktops. It's not designed for mobile. So because what happens by default, again, because, you know, there are still a lot of older websites that are still out there. If you haven't designed it for mobile devices will just kind of assume, well, your screen size is roughly 1024, right? So it'll kind of set its logical size, use a logical size of 1024 to render the image. Again, it may be different numbers, you know, that may be vary by device, but it'll use a kind of guess there as to how big the website will do and actually render it that and scale it up or down based on how much space is actually there. So I don't want that behavior. I want it to actually render it at 100%. I want to render it at the actual size of the device. Okay, and so that's where this viewport tag comes in. So I'm going to add in here meta viewport. Do Control/uncomment this. All right, so as it is, I put that in there. You won't see any change on the desktop side. What we will see is a change on the mobile side. So let me go back into the developer tools. And now that's in the mobile view, you can see how it's changed, right? You can see that it now looks like it's zoomed in. Well, that's because it's now rendering it at the actual resolution of the screen. Rather than using an arbitrary number to say, well, let's make an old desktop site look okay on a mobile site, it's going to look like this. Okay. Now, obviously, this is now not particularly ideal, right? Because this website was obviously not designed to work on mobile, and specifically this whole website is designed with a fixed layout in mind. So, and if we look at the CSS, say I look at speaker, I can kind of figure out from the CSS that's there that this was designed for a screen that is, you know, it's setting it to a fixed layout of 990 pixels wide. So that's where it was kind of, without the viewport, it was kind of guessing, well, okay, I'll render it 990. That'll give me roughly the size or somewhere in that ballpark. All right, but that's not what we want, right? So we want to build these things to be actually mobile responsive. But that is one thing you have to remember to do, is put in this viewport tag in order to do the things that we're going to do in a minute. Now, with the viewport tag, there's a few things that I can set. The way that we're going to set this viewport tag up for actually all the examples that we do this semester, and I would recommend just leaving it this way, is saying the width is equal to the device width, and the initial scale is 1. That's how I would leave it, but there are some other settings that you can set. So namely, the width, if you set the width, that is what is the logical width of the viewport. What do you want it to render as? You know, render it as if the screen is 1024, 1920. That setting allows you to say, well, I built a fixed width website. So for instance, here we can see this one was rendered at 990. Well, if I want to force it to treat it as treat the screen as roughly that scale, I might set the width to, say, 1024. Okay, I need to get out of the developer tools, and back in. Did I save that? Refresh this. F12. So that's generally a hint, although it seems to not have picked it up properly. Oh, because I need to not set the initial scale. So if I just set width, it'll figure out what the scale is. So if I just set the width, there we go. So if I just set the width to 1024, then it'll try and render it at that, in the sense that it was originally designed for that. Similarly, if I set it to maybe 2000, save that, get out of here, back in F12, it's going to try and render it for a screen that was those 2000 pixels wide. So I can use this viewport to give it at least some hint of how to render a fixed width website in here by kind of adjusting the scale by default. But what we do want to allow it to, we do generally want to go ahead and design our websites for mobile. But to do that, we need to start by saying, well, the width, just use the actual width of the device, and etc. Use the actual dimensions of the device. So we can set the width, and kind of set the logical width of the viewport. We can set the logical height of the viewport. We can say what is the initial scale or zoom factor. So here we're just going to start that at 100%. We can also set, so those are kind of where should it start, where should it start looking, what should it look like immediately when you go to our website on a mobile device. Okay. We can also set the minimum and the maximum scale, and that controls how far the user can zoom in or zoom out. So like if I say set the minimum scale to 0.5, then they can't scale it less than 0.5, less than 50%. If I set the maximum scale to 4, then they can't zoom in any farther than 4 times. So depending on what you're building, sometimes you may want to set a minimum and maximum. Although I would say usually it's fine to just let there not be a minimum and a maximum. You can also set the user scalable setting to either yes or no. By default, it's yes. The user can zoom in and out, but you can set it to no to say the user can't use pinching to zoom in and out on your website. That may be generally that's something you want to shy away from. But if there is something already on your website that means pinching does something already, so for instance, let's say you have a map or some charts that are already handling that zoom on a chart or a map base layer, that may be a place where you want to say, well, you can't use zoom because I'm going to use zoom for this other thing on the page. So that's what that's about. But usually it's better to just go ahead and let the user zoom in and out of the page. All right. So that's a quick cover of the different parts there. Again, the constant we're going to usually use for the width is we're going to just say the width is the width of the device, and the initial scale is 1, and that will give us a good starting point for building websites that are mobile responsive. But then we'll need to use all the tools that we've talked about, from fluid widths and the media queries, which we're about to talk about. Okay, so now let's talk about media queries, which is the big thing for this chapter. This is the big new thing that allows us to really go beyond what we can do with fluid layouts to make websites that actually change how they appear based on the size of the screen. So the media rule is something that was introduced into CSS quite a while ago. It always starts with @media, it can be used to check for a bunch of different things about the device, or what kind of device it is. So we can do things like check, is the width of the device within a certain range? Is the width of the viewport bigger or smaller than this, both in terms of height and width? I can also check the actual dimensions of the device itself. So I can check the size of the viewport. I can check the size of the device. I can look at the orientation of the device. Is it landscape or portrait, as well as the resolution. What this media query, this media rule does is allows me to say, here's some CSS rules that are only applied to these kinds of devices. So I have all my default rules, which is what we've built so far. And I can say, okay, well, for these kinds of devices, I also want to apply some additional rules on top of it, which will change what the previous rules did. The other things that you can do is you can change the media type. So for instance, I can say, here's CSS that I want to apply if you're displaying it on a screen. Here's some CSS I want you to apply if you're printing the page out. So we can create some specific CSS for printing. I can also apply some special CSS for speech or screen readers. So screen readers have maybe a different view of the page. There's also some other things that you can look at, namely media features, like does it support this or that, on different user agents and widths. Now, what we're going to talk about primarily here in this section is really just how do I change how do I apply CSS based on the width of the screen, width of the viewport, sorry. That's as deep as we're going with this, but recognize that the media role can do quite a bit more, and is worth doing some more reading than what's just in Chapter 8. If you want to learn, there's some basic introduction to it on W3C Schools. I think Mozilla Developer Network also has an article on it. You can also go to the official documents from W3 and read how this is officially and formally defined. This gets a little bit deeper. One thing to know, and the way we're going to set this up, we're going to keep this all in one CSS file. So we're going to say these rules are default, and these rules are these rules are on top of that. You can also actually, in the link tag that you put in your head, you can actually specify what media that style sheet is for. So specifically here, you can say media screen. So this style sheet would be only applied for when you're rendering it on a screen. And then I say media print. So this CSS file would only be applied when I'm printing the page. So you can specify it that way and say, here's your style sheet for print. Here's your style sheet for screens. But the way we're going to use it primarily is going to be what you see down here. So media screen, here's some rules for screen, and we may have some other rules for print as well. So the basic structure of a media query always starts with @media. Then there's an optional only word followed by the media type. That first part you always have to have. The rest beyond that is optional. Beyond that, we can say give a few different expressions. So we can have an expression based on a wide number of things, but the three that we'll talk about here are going to be the width of the viewport, the height of the viewport, and the landscape, or should it be landscape or portrait. And each of those additional pieces are separated with an and. Okay. So if I want these rules to only apply to screen and not say print, then I'm going to put screen as the media type. And that's will be all the examples that we see here for Chapter 8. They're only targeting the screen media type. Now, that word only is worth discussing briefly. The word only is entirely optional. You don't have to put the word only there. But what it's actually there for is to deal with some incompatibilities with older versions of Internet Explorer. Okay, so we can now control we can use these media queries with the width and height and orientation of devices, but that was not supported in older versions of CSS, which are older Internet Explorer still doesn't support some of these. So the word only is basically a hack to get older versions of IE to not read our rules. So by putting the word only, we're saying IE just ignore, IE6, IE7, IE8, etc. Just ignore these rules that we have here. Don't execute these rules that are based on the size of the screen, because it doesn't understand those. So only is, again, it's really just targeted for supporting older Internet Explorer. That's why that word is there. So all of these rules that we create, we're just going to put the word only in there so that IE doesn't read those, because it's going to treat that as the media type. All right. So an example of how we might use this, we might say media only screen. So this is only going to apply to screens. And we're going to say screens that have a maximum width of 767. So whatever rules I put inside these curly brace, those are only going to apply to screens that are 766. Or viewport, when the viewport is 760 pixels wide or smaller. Okay, so that's what max width says. It says this size or smaller. On the contrary, I can say min width, and that would say it's this size or bigger. Okay, if the screen is at least this wide. I can use those things together, the min and the max, to say, well, the screen size has to be between these two. So if it's 480 pixels or bigger, but smaller than 706, but 700 between 480 and 760, I can say min is 480, max is 767. So anything that's in between there, that's where we're going to apply it. Now, you can do that. You can do the between. I would strongly recommend that you don't use the between method there. The way that we really want to set this, because it tends to create little pockets where right at the intersection between the two sizes you get weird behavior. So generally speaking, we're only going to specify one of those two sides. We're going to specify the max, or we're going to specify the min width, but not both. Similarly, you can specify things in terms of the min and the max height, but that generally does not work all that well, because the part that matters the most for how we lay out most websites is generally in terms of the width of the screen and not the height of the screen. So that's where we're going to go on the width. All right. So there's two different ways to approach this. We can say we'll design the website for desktop first, and then we'll make it work for mobile. And if we're doing that approach, then our media queries are going to look one way. If we're starting with mobile and then going to desktop, they're going to look a different way. Okay. So if I'm starting with desktop first, all the rules that I define that are not in a media query are the ones that are applied by default. They're applied, the ones that are not in a media query are applied to, those are your rules for your target device, your primary target. Okay. So we're going to start those out. We're going to write all those rules outside of a media query. Next, we're going to say, well, okay, we want to support tablets. And we're going to say tablets are anything that's less than 960 pixels. Okay, anything that's less than 960 pixels, we're going to say, okay, here's our styles for tablets that are in a portrait layout. Okay, so let's apply that CSS for tablets. I'm going to say anything that's smaller than that. So if it's smaller than 700 and if it's smaller than 767 or smaller, okay, well then we'll call that that range is roughly where landscape smartphones are. So we'll apply some CSS for smartphones that are landscape orientation. Then finally, smaller than that, okay, so we'll call that smartphones that are in portrait orientation. So anything that's 579 or less, well, here's the styles for that. So we're saying, okay, let's start by designing it and making it work on desktop, and then I'll scale it. I'll make it work on tablets in portrait orientation, and then we'll go to smartphones and landscape orientation, and then from there we'll go down to smartphones in portrait orientation. So I'm starting with the biggest device and I have to work my way down. Now it is important as you're building these rules, you do have to work from the largest to the smallest. You can't skip around because all the rules that we apply here to tablet portraits are actually being applied to all of the smaller devices as well. Both of anything above for a bigger device is also being applied to the smaller devices. So if I add in additional rule to here for tablets that are in portrait orientation, that also affects smaller devices along the way. So do be forewarned with that, because again, this is applied to anything that's smaller than that. The other way I can approach this is what would be referred to as mobile first. So I design all my CSS targeting my smallest devices. And then from there, I say, well, let's apply a little bit of CSS for devices that are bigger and bigger and bigger. Here you'll notice I'm using the min width, right? If it's this size or bigger, I'm progressively moving from smaller devices to bigger devices. And this is the way I would strongly recommend you build your websites. I would strongly recommend you build your websites starting from the smallest devices going up to the biggest ones. And the reasoning, therefore, it might seem, okay, well, I can do it either way, and it'll be fine. I can start with the big devices and go down, or I can start with the smaller devices and go up. No difference, right? Well, the fact of the matter is, whichever device you start with, whichever device you focus on, will be the one that looks the best. Whichever device you start with will be the one that looks the best. So if you start with desktops, your website's going to be great on desktops. It won't be so good on any device that's smaller than desktop. So you say, I'm going to target and work on my device on a 1920 by 1080 screen. It's going to look great on 1920 by 1080. It probably will not look as good on anything else. That includes things that are bigger as well as things that are smaller. So whichever thing you shoot for first, that's what it's going to look best at. And it's not necessarily going to look as good on anything else. And same thing applies if you start with mobile. It's going to look great on mobile. It may not look as good on anything bigger. But what I find is if I shoot for desktop and I build that order version first, I generally find that immediately out of the box, the mobile version will be completely unusable. If I start with desktop, the mobile version will be completely unusable. It will work okay in kind of the ranges of what I designed it for and work okay on sizes that are bigger than it, but it will not work at all on mobile. Okay. On the contrary, if I start with my smallest device, if I start with mobile, then it's going to work great on the smallest devices, and it actually will be okay on anything bigger. Generally, I find whatever I design to, it's going to be okay. It may not be optimized for things bigger, but it will be okay. It will be usable. Versus going down, whatever you design for, the screen sizes, the device sizes that are usually smaller than that, generally you will find that they don't work. So that's the difference. Scaling down, generally things break entirely to the point where it's not usable, versus scaling up, it's like, okay, it works, but it doesn't make efficient use of the screen space, if that makes sense. So usually you will come out on the better side if you target mobile, build your website for mobile first, and then make it work for desktop. You usually will find that results in a better result, because you won't get into a case where it doesn't work at all on a particular device. So that's what I would recommend. I would recommend doing all of your designs in a mobile first sort of pattern. Start with the smallest and work your way up, because if you make it work on mobile, it will work just fine on desktop. It just may not be ideal, but you can come back and fix that later. So one tool for specifically solving a common problem, which is that you need to take your nav bar and make it work well on mobile. It's a common thing that we run into where you say, well, on I've got this nav bar that works just fine on desktop. It's horizontal, but I need it to work. I need a version of it that works on mobile. Okay, so Slick Nav is one way to do this. In a week or two, we'll talk about how to do this with Bootstrap, which is actually a much better solution to this, and gives you some more options. This is one way to do it with relatively little changes to an existing website. You make it mobile friendly. Okay. So what this looks like is it'll take your existing desktop website, assuming it's been built in the pattern that we've shown, assuming that you have a nav tag and then unordered lists underneath there for the different tiered navigation. It will go ahead and look at that and make a copy of that is more mobile friendly. So we'll show up here as a kind of a hamburger icon with the text menu, and then you can click on that and find the links here. They'll expand and be vertical. And also anything that you have a submenu, you can see here About Us has that little arrow. That means there's more options underneath it. Now, in order to add SlickNav, you'll first need to download the SlickNav CSS file from the internet, and then you'll need ads as well as a SlickNav JavaScript file. You'll need to download that. You'll put the SlickNav CSS in the styles or the CSS folder, and we'll put the JS file for SlickNav. We'll put that into the JS folder. So we need to integrate, in order for SlickNav to work, we need the SlickNav style sheet. We have to add that in, but we also need some JavaScript, which we haven't really covered yet, but here's the code that you're going to put in there. You can put these different script tags. So the first script tag is for something called jQuery, which SlickNav is a plugin for jQuery, so it relies on jQuery. So we need to add that in first. Next thing we need to add in is our jQuery JavaScript file. So we're going to add that in here as source. All of this stuff would typically go, at least for this example, you're going to put in your head. We'll talk about some other options further in the course. But all of this we're going to put in our head. And then third, we need another JavaScript here. And this is a custom or embedded JavaScript. And here we're saying, well, kind of ignore the details for a moment, but basically we're saying, okay, here's the nav menu is the ID of the desktop menu, and then mobile menu is the ID of your mobile friendly menu. So it'll take this desktop menu that you have and create a mobile menu. You need this short script to tell it which of those two IDs are you using. All right, so here's what the HTML looks like to go with that. Remember, you need to have a desktop and a mobile. Now, here we've got the desktop navigation bar. We've given an ID of nav menu. You can see that's the first one we passed in. And then we also have a placeholder for the mobile menu. Now, the mobile menu, we don't put any HTML in there. SlickNav will go ahead and create all of the HTML for the mobile version of that based on what's in the desktop version. So we'll just leave that nav tag empty. We just need to give it that ID. So nav menu and mobile menu. So you can see we have two nav bars. So we're going to show, so we're going to use one of those nav bars for desktop, one of those for mobile. What that means is that we'll need to add in some rules to initially on desktop, first of all, hide SlickNav, hide the mobile menu. So by default in the regular CSS, we'll say mobile menu is display none to hide it. And then in a media rule, we want to say if the screen size is smaller than a certain threshold, so here the threshold is 767, if the threshold is smaller than this, then we're going to say, okay, let's hide the desktop menu using display none, and let's show the mobile menu using display block. So that's how we switch between the desktop menu and the mobile menu. So let's look at an example of what this actually looks like in practice. So if I go to, I need to open up chapter 8 book example. So open folder, I'm going to go to book apps, chapter 8. We're going to look at media queries, fluid, town hall, and this is going to be here. And I'm going to open up Samson with live server. Okay, so here's what the page looks like in desktop. And if I scale down, there's where SlickNav appears. So you can see the desktop nav bar disappeared, that navigation menu disappeared, and now this one is visible. So in here I can expand it. I can see the different options. If I click on speakers, you can see that expands, Samson. So it will do this tiered navigation in a vertical layout instead of a horizontal layout, which works better for mobile. In fact, if I go back, let's make this screen a little bit bigger. There's our desktop. Let me go into my mobile view. Here's it on an iPhone. So initially when you go to the page, it would be collapsed. Click on it to expand it, and I can get to those individual pieces. So that's how that looks then on a mobile side. Okay, so SlickNav is a quick way to get that up and running without writing a lot of code or changing a lot of code. If you've got an existing nav bar that at least uses those semantic tags of unordered lists and anchor tags, it will convert it to a mobile-friendly version kind of for you. But in a few weeks, we'll talk about how to do this with Bootstrap, which I think gives us a little bit of a better version of the same thing. So yeah, so we look at that. Okay, so that's the end of this. Again, the big thing I hope that you took away from that is the value of setting your layouts in a fluid layout, first of all, because that at least gives you some range of flexibility rather than being strict about what size everything needs to be. It's much better to specify things with relative dimensions to start with, both for your font size as well as for your widths and heights of things. And then also that some of the things that you can do with media queries. So media queries are going to allow you to set CSS at different points in scale. We'll talk more about that in kind of the coming weeks as we're working with media queries and making responsive websites. We looked at SlickNav real quickly, how you add that in to quickly get a mobile menu that will work out of the box without changing a bunch of code. We talked about how to use the browser to test your responsive web designs. We look at a few of the different components and pieces to that. That's really all I have for today. So your reading assignments are up on Perusal. Your homework and lab assignments are on Inside Rankin. And I'll see you for the next lecture.